Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the, let's see, we are in Unit 6, I believe, of 513. I appreciate you all being here and being on time. I am excited for our discussion this evening. I have a few general housekeeping items, and then we will launch into our unit discussion and participate in our presentation. So the first item is I want to make sure that everyone was able to access the new MindTap resource through the Cengage publisher, which is the publisher of your text. You now have access to the full ebook version of that and all of the online resources that go along with that include lectures and sample quizzes and let's see, what else? A full audio version of your of the text, so you can actually be on the treadmill or something or taking a walk and actually listen to a recording of the chapter. It also has this cool resource where you can, there's a number of different study tools, so you can create flashcards based on the glossary definitions that are in each chapter that you can study from, and there's just kind of there's highlighting resources for the text and things like that. So lots of exciting resources that I was unfortunately not aware of until very recently. So I'm excited to be able to work with the publisher and get a course designed just for you all and access just for you all. So I'll stop right there and see if there are any questions about accessing that, if there's been any issues, if you have any questions or concerns about that new resource. Okay, nothing there. All right, sounds good. Feel free to email me if there are any issues with that, or feel free to contact the name. If you have an issue with an account, you can contact that publisher directly, and I put her name and email in that announcement. Okay, another thing I have, let's see, I emailed you about a potential date change for our very last Zoom meeting. You may have not seen that yet. I just sent it out a few minutes ago. I realized that our last scheduled Zoom session was for our course wrap-up, which can be really valuable, but also I think it's important to be able to provide an opportunity with you to discuss older adulthood unit. A lot of people have some strong reactions to that material, and I would love to give you the opportunity to be able to kind of process that a little bit. And as well as, obviously, we'll have some time for group presentation on that day. So I'm hoping with this, advance notice that will work for you all. If there is a significant problem with that date change, especially if you're part of the group that is scheduled to present, please email me and let me know. And as I said in that email, if I don't hear from you, I will assume that you are okay with that change. But please do email me if there is a problem with that. And if there's only a few people that have an issue with it, because typically there's one or two people who can't join the Zoom sessions each week for whatever reason. So as long as it's not like half class has an issue with that, we'll probably go ahead and move forward with that. Thinking forward to, would you mind muting yourself? I hear some typing in the background, so if you haven't muted, please double check that. Thank you. Looking ahead to the Unit 3 quiz, that is going to be, not the Unit 3, the Quiz 3, that is due on October 29th at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. And I have had some questions about one of the quiz questions and have realized that it is not a good question. Usually I wait to have an analysis on that at the end, and I look at, I do a whole kind of item analysis on how everybody did before I kind of toss a question, but I have realized very early on that that needs to go. And so not the whole quiz, just one of the questions. So I wanted to give you some that I will be posting an announcement that may seem kind of strange, so I just wanted to tell you now. I will be giving you the answer to one of the quiz questions, so you basically get a freebie. It's too late in the game since other students have already taken the quiz for me to alter the quiz, so rather than having to kind of go down that route, I'm just going to give you the answer and let you use it. So you get a little half-point freebie there. Many of you, I expect, would have gotten it right anyway, but it's just a poorly worded question. There's basically 2 right answers, and you can't have that. And I didn't, and that went by me when I was publishing it. So apologies for that. I'm sure you're really, really sad that I'm giving you an answer to the quiz. Crying little tears right now, I'm sure. So just be on the lookout for that. I'll send that out after we cover that unit, so early next week. Let's see if there's anything else. I don't think I have any other kind of general housekeeping questions. Are there any general questions? I feel like it's been a few weeks since we chatted, so I wanted to give you a chance to check in and see if there's any issues or concerns with anything. You'll see on the modules that it says, on some of them it says update pending. That's when I just want to make sure that you have access to the readings and some of the videos and stuff, but I'm still kind of sorting and organizing those. Have most of the units up at this point. There's one thing I actually or 2 things I just added to the I went ahead and added to the middle childhood unit. I added another video. I realized there's not really any long documentaries for that unit, and I was going to put one in the adolescence unit, and there's way too many, way too many in there. So I'm kind of, I went ahead and added it. It still is related, but it's a really important one I want to make sure that we cover. So I went ahead and added that to middle childhood, but that's the only change. I think that should be the last change for middle childhood. So you should be good to go for the next several units. And I had noted earlier that I was going to be updating the CTE list. It has been updated, but I'm going to add one more CTE for the very last unit, for the older adulthood unit. That's going to be more kind of classic CTE style as opposed to more of the self-reflection, which is how it's kind of written. I love reading those for that unit. I get some powerful reflections in that, but it may not work so well for the group presentation. So I think that's the only change that I'll be making to the list at this point. All right, I'm gonna stop there with announcements. Any other questions?
I just want to know, can you see me? Can you tell here, Joy?
Hey, no, I cannot see. Are you a number? Are you? I don't.
Well, I'm the one that's had so much trouble with my technology, but we think we got it worked out. So okay. I can see you and one other person. So
okay.
But I'm here.
Okay, great. Yeah, all I see, if you don't click start video, because there's several people that I can't see. So if you don't click start video, then I won't be able to see you. I do see that you are here though. Thank you.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Like, oh. Okay.
Yeah, it's important to be on. Okay. And I can hear you, which is also a plus, because sometimes that doesn't work either. You can't hear me. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump into the unit. PowerPoint, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're not going to cover too many of the slides for this unit, but there are some really important discussion points that I wanted to go over. Namely, to really talk about how, and this should be pretty obvious to you by now by viewing all the videos and looking at the different slides and watching Dr. Combs-Orme lecture, is that our whole idea of infancy, and really when we talk about infancy, there's some variation that you may see. You may see kind of the first 2 years, the first 3 years. It's typically the first 2 to 3 years. So it's not very clear. It kind of depends on sort of which framework you're looking at. But for our purposes, we're talking about the first few years of life. And our understanding about how children grow and develop has changed so astronomically over the last 50 to 60 years that it's kind of boggles the mind. And our advances in the research in brain science and neurodevelopment and understanding the consequences and impact of abuse and neglect on the developing brain, trauma on the developing brain, healthy attachment, social emotional development, all of these things just simply were not understood in the same way that they are understood now. And culturally speaking, life in America for many families has changed dramatically also over the last 60 or so years. And there are just major differences in kind of our cultural norms, societal norms, our cultural expectations for how we treat children, for the role of children in our life, the importance of healthy attachment, the importance of social emotional development. All of these things have really evolved over the last, like I said, 50 or 60 years. And so it's an exciting time to even be having this conversation, because we frankly didn't really used to have this conversation. We thought that we weren't necessarily sure that infants experienced pain. We didn't necessarily know that infants were capable of emotion. We certainly didn't have the new field of infant mental health. we did not have that. That's very recent. And so it's an exciting time to really be looking at these issues and figuring out, what is a social worker's role? So there's some key pieces about this age and stage of development that I want to make sure that we cover. And one of the big pieces is that, historically, the main developmental task in infancy was survival. It's still survival to a huge degree, because you're not really able to kind of forage for food and find food until you can walk, or crawl, or that's not really happening for several years at this point. So you are completely dependent on your caregivers at this age, and infant development is incredibly influenced by the environment, the stress of your caregivers, the quality of your early learning environments, the quality of your, your family life. Do you have access to resources? Do you have access to medical care? Are you getting regular checkups? If you have an infection, are you able to access medication to, help with that issue? Are you able to breastfeed? We now understand the need to support women exclusively breastfeeding their babies for the first 6 months of life. That's pretty much the standard recommendation now, and we know that does not happen for many, many, many babies. So there's a lot of cultural changes, and there's a lot to kind of grasp and understand. Some of the societal changes to highlight are that both parents are really now working. That's kind of a standard that did not used to be the case. So if both parents are working, suddenly from kind of a policy standpoint and a cultural standpoint, there needs to be a huge focus on childcare, on daycares, on the quality of, like I said, of early learning environments. You're there, 40, sometimes 50 hours a week, you're in the care of another person. Or another group of people, and around other babies. And so there's a whole lot that we have to consider now that maybe we didn't used to. There's greater numbers of unmarried women. There's an increased number of teenage mothers, and an increased substance abuse by mothers that is also more prevalent than it used to be. And also things like the welfare reform efforts of the late 1990s under the Clinton administration has also had an impact on very vulnerable families, and really this whole focus on you can receive welfare benefits, but you have to, there's a work component. So it's like kind of layers and layers of pressure and stress for many families. The key pieces that were really covered in your text, kind of the hallmarks of infancy, are really looking at physical growth, motor development, so learning to, push yourself up, then learning to crawl, then learning to kind of walk but by holding on to things, and then learning to walk independently. Vocal development and learning language and learning to talk, and cognitive and social development. And we'll kind of focus this evening more on social emotional development and infant mental health. Physical growth during the first year is pretty extraordinary, and the growth and size of an infant really depends on environmental conditions as well as your endowment genetically. So it kind of goes back to that, thinking about the resilience scale and the fulcrum is, where is that fulcrum? So genetically, what have you inherited? Are you going to be tall? Are you going to be short? Are you going to have, are you going to be at risk for obesity or not? It's so there's a lot that you're, kind of coming in to your life with, genetically speaking, but so much of how that gets expressed, as we've talked about this semester, is totally dependent on your environment. So a few things to highlight here, kind of going back to the infant brain. We know it's the most critical thing to biophysical human development. At the first year of life, it is half the size of the adult brain. So just thinking about a little baby and they're, almost, kind of bobblehead, they just get these big heads, and it's because it's half the size that it's going to be as an adult. There are billions of neurons that are working to create connections and relationships with each other in different parts of the brain. And proper nutrition during this time where the brain is growing so rapidly is absolutely critical. What is the thing that we know helps communication inside the brain? What is that kind of wrapping around the axons in the brain that helps with healthy communication? Can somebody tell me?
Isn't that myelin or myelin?
Myelin. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, and the myelin sheath is what wraps around the axons, and it helps. It's like insulation on an electrical wire. It helps those electrical impulses in the brain work really fast, work efficiently, go to where they need to go, not get disrupted, not distracted. It's a very, very important part. And that myelin, it's basically made up of fat. It's a fatty sheath that covers those axons. And so the health of that, of the myelin and the process of myelination is very dependent on the health of the baby, and that proper nutrition is right there connected to that healthy brain growth. So we cannot understate the importance of nutrition. Again, goes right back to the importance of breastfeeding. And if you're unable to be breastfed when you're this age, when you're very little, there's importance of kind of consistent, formula. Sometimes babies just don't even get the right consistency, or there's lack of understanding about how to mix the formula or prepare the formula in an appropriate way. So there's all kinds of opportunities here for things to not go well, and lots of opportunities for things to go very well. So focusing on that nutrition, especially from an assessment piece. So when you're working with families, assessing a parent's ability to provide that appropriate nutrition. Do they even know what is appropriate? Kids don't come with manuals. So a lot of times, people really do need that kind of basic education about, what is appropriate, what is healthy, what's going to help their baby grow in the best way. The social environment is also critical to healthy development. So that includes, parents and caregivers and also just the physical environment. So is it clean? Is it healthy? And there's, some controversy even around something as simple as cleanliness. People kind of tend to assume that, like, of course you want everything needs to be antibacterial and, kind of clean, but they've actually done research and found that, that children who, there was a study I read recently that compared, kind of the immune systems of children and health of children who were raised in households with dishwashers versus not dishwashers. So kind of you had to wash your dishes by hand versus putting them in the dishwasher. And actually found that kids had higher rates of things like asthma and infections and things like that if they did have a dishwasher, which is a little counterintuitive. So even something that seems very simple can oftentimes become very complicated. So there's a lot to consider and think about during this time. Okay, let's see. So a little point about milestones, your understanding of typical and healthy growth of an infant, but all throughout life. I mean, that's why we spend an entire semester talking about human development, because it's the foundation of what you're going to be doing as a social worker. And when it comes to actually, working in clinical practice, having a solid understanding of what is typical or what is expected is going to help you be able to identify what is not typical or what could be potentially a red flag and problematic for things for children. But also trying to understand, even when you're working with adults, what was their life like as a child and how did that influence their growth? And especially with things like the quality of the parent-child relationship, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes here. That dyadic relationship is really, critical to, healthy attachment, and that healthy attachment becomes the roadmap for all future relationships for the life of that individual. So they're critically important. But going back to milestones, they help us understand the normal or typical sequence of development. So pretty much, and there's kind of going to be a range. So most people are going to kind of be in the middle range, and then you're going to have your outliers that are sort of lagging behind the larger group of people, and then you're going to have your folks who are kind of way ahead of the game. So your little babies that are walking, like I had a little cousin who, I think he was walking at something crazy like 7 or 8 months. Like I didn't even know how it was possible. Maybe it was 9 months. It was very, very early and very kind of strange, honestly. But it was possible. And there's, kids who can read and speak very, very early. So, and then there's kids who don't speak until after, till they're like maybe 2.5. So you're going to have this range, but understanding kind of what is expected or typical of most kids is going to be really helpful. And so you can think about that in kind of all domains. So physically, emotionally, and cognitively with their cognitive development with learning. The AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, recommends screening, kind of just developmental screening to see if you're hitting those milestones at 9, 18, 24, and 30 months. And looking at things like developmental delay, which may not quite qualify for as a developmental disorder, but it may be something that you need to make sure you get a more in-depth screen or more referral for a specialist. Are things like those that cannot perform a certain developmental task that 90% of other babies can perform. So that's going to be not necessarily, may not develop into a full disorder, but it's going to be a cause for some caution and potentially some intervention. So I'm not going to get into this. So I wanted to talk about, just jump in here to infant mental health and focus on its importance and on attachment, and then we will wrap up our discussion for today. So I told you a few minutes ago that infant mental health is a really emerging field, and that is because the organization 0 to 3, which if you have not investigated them, they're a fantastic organization, have a huge amount of resources, and they focus on children 0 to 3. And what does that look like? And there was a 0 to 3 diagnostic classification task force that developed a kind of this whole idea of infant mental health in this definition, and really talked about infant mental health as being the capacity of a child from birth to 3 to experience, regulate, and express emotions. We never used to talk about infants having emotions, let alone experiencing them, regulating, and expressing them. So this really was a big step forward in our understanding, because once you name something, you can start to study it. You can start to really, develop programs and interventions that support these different theories. And so it was a really big leap for us. You're also looking at the capacity of an infant to form close, secure interpersonal relationships. The quality of those secure interpersonal relationships, again, forms the roadmap for all future relationships. So if you're working with an adult who's struggling in interpersonal relationships, it's probably going to be a really good idea for you to investigate what were their early, what was their early life like. You also want infants to be exploring the environment and learning in the context of the family, community, and cultural expectations for young children. And that cultural expectations for young children piece is very, very important, because we know that varies, and there may be some variations there for specifically expectations. So what is expected in one culture may not be the same thing that is expected in another culture. So the field of infant mental health really looks at how are infants, working towards these goals, and then also from a kind of a system standpoint and a professional standpoint and a societal standpoint, what are we doing to support infant mental health? One kind of sad policy example is that in the United States, we do not have paid maternity leave. And so that is a classic example of, we know what the research says about attachment. We know that, babies are going to do best when they have a period of uninterrupted time to grow and develop and form close attachment relationships, to consistently breastfeed and be supported by their primary caregivers and form those healthy attachments. It's really challenging to do that if you essentially have to go back to work after 6 weeks, or even 3 months. It's a very challenging thing to balance. And women and even fathers, there's just not paid maternity leave or paternity leave typically, unless your private company pays for that. But it's not policy like it is in many other developed countries. Infant mental health is also important because infants are vulnerable to abuse and neglect. They may be seen to withdraw from interactions and even seem to suffer from depression. Again, that's very new. We didn't used to think that babies could suffer from depression. And they can develop problems with feeding, sleeping, and behavioral regulation. And lastly, there can be problems that arise in the infant and parent relationship for a variety of reasons. Some of those may have to do with the infant themselves. Some of them may have to do with the parent, and some of them may have to do with that relationship. But when we're looking at infant mental health and we're thinking about supporting healthy development at this age, we are always going to be talking about, from an intervention standpoint, as the client being that dyadic relationship between the primary caregiver and the infant. That is the key piece here with infant mental health, is it is the relationship that is the client, not necessarily just the mom and not necessarily just the baby. It's that relationship together, because that's what makes the huge difference in terms of healthy development. So things like previous pregnancy loss for a mom may impact the relationship of the baby that was born. Postpartum depression is absolutely huge, and one of the biggest risk factors for poor development in infancy. In infants, medical or developmental problems may actually cause stress and strain on the caregiver, which can interrupt the attachment relationship. Parents' drug use, parents' mental illness, huge impact. Abuse of an infant obviously would be a huge risk factor. And prolonged separations. I mean, think about incarceration of a parent is an ACE, an adverse childhood experience in the original ACE study. Things like family stress. There's a whole dynamic of caregiver strain. It's an important thing to assess for and measure when you're working with parents, because high strain and high stress with caregivers is a huge risk factor for abuse and neglect. Absolutely huge. I mean, if you just think about, shaken baby syndrome, it's pretty much, parent, it's kind of, you could call it like parental frustration syndrome. I mean, it's a huge, thing that, parents can do just simply out of frustration, not really knowing how to appropriately address the baby's stress. And even a parent with their own longstanding attachment disorder, sometimes there's just an intergenerational, repeat of, unhealthy attachment in their own lives. So what were the parents' attachment relationships like? And then are they just repeating, whatever those issues were with their own children? Can also be a risk factor. So I want to actually, I'm going to stop right there. I want to show a video. This is really quick. I know y'all probably watched this already, but I just want to show it again, and let's talk about it real quick.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 34 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay. So I'm gonna stop sharing. So I'm very curious, what are some of your reactions after watching that video?
I felt bad for the baby.
Okay, is Brittany talking?
Oh, yes. When I watched it the first time and the second time, I felt bad for the baby. I started to think about in one of the lectures, it discussed synchronicity and that type of attachment, how they become the same. Either they could become the same in a positive way or in that way in a negative way. So that's what I thought about.
Yeah, the synchrony, absolutely. Yes, that's very true, because it's like, it goes into that, that kind of goes back to that whole serve and return, which is one of the frameworks videos illustrated that. It's like the baby's kind of, it's just like tennis. They've served up, a cue, and then mom is returning that cue. And that's how those neural connections in our brain are made, is that constant back and forth, that constant serve and return. But when mom stops and can't kind of return that serve, baby's screeching and pointing, and then all of a sudden baby's completely decompensating. It almost looks like if the baby wasn't strapped down, that she would just slide right out of the seat that she's in. She's so distressed. And that was just for not even a minute. That was about a minute that, she was doing that, or less, that she actually had this still face. So what are some other reactions to the video? I heard somebody else talking.
I didn't realize that babies were that sensitive, that they could pick up on their environment in that way. I guess, like you were saying, a lot of this is very new, and I think I underestimated how intelligent they are even at that stage, to be able to mimic and realize, like, this person is no longer responding to me. And in my mind, I'm thinking, like, are they thinking, like, did I do something? Like, I kind of wonder, like, is that the beginning of that? Like, what's going on? What did I do? What is it? And the fact that they could have stress. I just never expected that.
Thank you for saying that, because I think so many people probably, out in the world, don't realize this, and that it is new. And we, a couple lectures ago, I think it was in one of Dr. Combs-Orm's lectures, she talked about the right orbitofrontal cortex, how stimulated that is. That is that visual, but then visual processing with emotions. And so all of that, it's kind of like emotion is the language that babies have at that age, because cognitively they're not there. Cognitively, they're not able to process, mom worked 2 shifts today. She's really tired. Let me give her a break and give her some space, and not be all up in her, business right when she's very needy, like right when she gets in the door. Babies are not thinking that. Babies are thinking, I really miss mom, or where's my caregiver? Where's that person that I love her voice so much? And I don't quite understand why, but I know I feel better when I see her. They're not cognitively, they're not processing any of that. They don't have the capacity yet, but they do have the capacity to understand safety, love, comfort. I'm getting my needs met. I'm crying, somebody's picking me up. And all of that creates these, internal patterns, and develop how, or influence how that attachment relationship develops. It's really important. Let's get 1 or 2 more comments.
It made me feel sad for mothers that are experiencing postpartum depression. I think that sort of that face that she made is such that's what a mother who's going through that looks like. And again, I think it just goes back to the caregiver infant relationship, and that occurs like across all sort of socioeconomic levels. And I just don't think that there's enough attention given to that. I think that women are given this sort of assessment after 6 weeks of giving birth, but the hormones actually stay in their bodies up to a year, and there's no follow-up for women. And it can sort of sneak up on them at any time during that year. So I think that's sort of what I thought of.
Absolutely, Christy. I think that's really, really well stated. Is like, are pediatricians talking about this? Are they trained in this? Are they, what kind of tools do they have to really help parents understand this? And then sometimes, like one of the comments that came up earlier today in a class when we were talking about this was, sometimes it's like the opposite of, it's like information overload. And so you get so stressed and there's so much anxiety that, like, if you don't, make organic muffins and make organic baby food and play with your child for 6 hours on the, have playtime on the floor, and everything is perfect and, all this stuff, that like the babies are just not going to flourish. And it's just absolutely not true. So it's like, how do you find that balance between, supporting, having enough information and education and resources available, but then not doing, because we all know what happens when we have too much stress, we can't function. So how do we prevent that kind of overload as well? And, maternal depression is a huge, huge risk factor. And that's exactly why is, when you're not able to interact with that baby, or even especially have feelings like, I hate my baby, or my baby ruined my life. Or, in Tennessee, 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. Doesn't mean that the baby's not loved, or not that there's, something wrong with that, but it just kind of goes like, for a lot of people, it's a surprise. So we have 80,000 babies born in Tennessee, and half, so 40,000 babies a year, are not planned for a variety of reasons. So not like, stigmatizing unplanned pregnancies, but just kind of saying they're not all, you're not always fully prepared emotionally for the journey that you're about to go on. And so, what's going on with that, it's just kind of another one of those factors that can help influence that attachment relationship overall. So there any other final thoughts about that video?
I just think that it kind of reiterates the importance of like social reinforcement, especially when you're dealing with children who haven't quite acquired language, like how important it is to even engage through smiling or touching or basically any other form of communication, because they do communicate that way, and that is how like we promote language development. So if they're in an environment where that's kind of absent, it's it's essentially like detrimental to like their cognitive development as well as like their socio-emotional development.
Absolutely, Hillary. That's really well stated. Is it's like I think about, I think I've talked about in here, like development to me in some ways is like the Grand Canyon. I think about all of those layers of sedimentary rock and how it's just kind of a layer on top of a layer on top of a layer. And so everything that is going on at 6 months of age is on top of what was going on at 3 months of age, which is on top of what was going on in utero. And then what's at 18 months is on top of everything in the first year. And so it's like all of those little pieces do matter all the way to that level of detail of how are we smiling? How are we interacting? How are we, doing the, working with the babbling and the cooing and in next week's unit, when you get into early childhood, there's some information about even just the number of words and the vocabulary that children have at 3 years old, and how that's predictive of things like graduating from high school. So all of it is, that early foundation is so critical. And it, in some ways, is as simple and yet as profound as how are we, face-to-face interacting with that baby. And it's because a screen is not enough. It's that human reaction in human interaction that is going to really support that development from both words and those facial cues. That's why, again, that right orbitofrontal cortex is so critical, because it's processing all of those different cues and helping to build those different neural connections. Okay, we need to move on to the group presentation. I appreciated that discussion. Are we ready to go, group? Austin, Abby, Kendria, and Brittany?
Yes. It's Kendria, Abby, and Brittany. We don't have Austin.
Okay, did you never have Austin?
We've never had Austin, so it's been...
I think I made a note on, oh yeah, sorry. I made a note that I was not looking at. I did know that. Okay.
Okay, one second. I'm the one who's leading. The only thing is I'm having a hard time opening the PowerPoint with Zoom going at the same time for some reason. One second. I just noticed this was not working. Hold on. Oh. Okay, I think I got it.
Okay.
I'm going to share screen. And let's see. Okay, does everyone see that? Does that look?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, Abby and Brittany, whenever you're ready.
Hello, and thank you for coming to this information session about the residential parenting program provided by the Washington State Department of Corrections. Did you know that Washington State is one of only a few states that allows some incarcerated mothers to keep their infant children with them for up to 30 months? My colleagues and I are here today to provide you with vital information about your baby's development and how you, as a nurturing caregiver, can form a healthy attachment with your child. Infancy is a critical time in your child's development. Because of all we know about this time in your baby's life, we believe the residential parenting program is a great decision for you and your child.
Thank you for explaining that, Abby. And we're going to go over some information that relates to that. Infancy is a period which lasts from 2 to 3 years of age. During this time frame, infants are undergoing rapid brain development. Neuron growth is busy during the first 3 months. During infancy, babies are dependent on experience expectant contacts. This occurs through constant interaction and proximity with the caregiver. In these interactions, oxytocin is developed within the infant and the mother. This helps an infant to be able to relax and have a more secure bond with the caregiver. If an infant does not have a secure contact with his or her caregiver, there is a risk of the infant not having the ability to self-regulate. If an infant does not have experience expected contacts, then that infant will lose vital sensory abilities. At birth, infants already have reflexes, which include the ability to stand and step. These functions and others will become voluntary later in their lives. In infancy, there are sensitive periods which may influence infant brain development. Sensitive periods would be dependent on culture and have a less static period in which they have to occur. An infant may demonstrate their connection to their caregiver by their language. Examples include cooing and babbling, which are forms of language in which the caregiver participates with the child by reacting to his or her sounds. Breast milk is essential during this time. It provides the nutrition that the infant needs, and it also reduces the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. Also, during this time, infants develop attachment, which will impact the rest of their lives.
Thank you, Brittany. And now that we understand the importance of the infancy stage, let's discuss attachment and the vital role it plays in healthy development. So what is attachment? It is a set of behaviors designed to develop a sense of trust and keep the infant close to its caregiver continuously in order to assure survival. So how does attachment happen? Within 6 to 7 months of birth, the infant begins to differentiate specific behaviors used to not only signal its caregiver, but also show preference towards certain individuals in its environment. Attachment develops with stimulation of the right orbitofrontal cortex of the brain through nurturing. It is this portion of the baby's brain that processes nonverbal cues and recognizes faces and specific details of its caregiver's face. The baby will cry, smile, give eye contact, and the caregiver responds by returning the smile and eye contact, talking, singing, kissing the baby to provide reassurance. In order for attachment to form successfully, it requires interaction between both the caregiver and the baby, which builds trust. The synchronicity is also promoted through the release of the hormone oxytocin that occurs during nursing, as well as behaviors of imitation between the baby and the caregiver. It is also important to note that the mother is only one caregiver to whom a baby can form a secure attachment. An infant can form several attachments to caregivers who provide warmth and consistent nurturing. So what do the studies show? We have a few important studies here. One is the still face experiment. Edward Tronick designed an experiment to study how important signed an experiment to study how infant reacts when a mother stops interacting with her baby. And she holds a still face and does not respond to the baby's behavior. The baby becomes frustrated and begins to cry in response to being ignored by her mother. The experiment illustrates how social and reactive infants are to their environment, and the importance of the mother's role in forming attachment by reassuring the baby, which brings the baby back to a state of calm. Okay. Harry Harlow raised Reese monkeys in semi-isolation away from their mothers since birth. When a young monkey was presented to a wire mother that supplied food and a cloth mother that provided no food, the monkey preferred the cloth mother. This illustrates the natural need to form an attachment with a caregiver who provides comfort, warmth, and a feeling of security. Mary Ainsworth developed the strange situation procedure to examine an infant's reaction to being left alone with a stranger after the mother exited the room. The results of the infant's reaction in the study have contributed to the following key attachment types. Secure attachment. Baby is content when caregiver is around and upset when separated, even when strangers are present and try to offer comfort. Baby is happy and feels safe again and willing to explore when the caregiver returns. Ambivalent attachment. Baby is in distress and cries during separation from caregiver. Due to a lack of trust, baby is insecure and continues to cry once caregiver returns. Avoidant attachment. Baby expresses no specific attachment to caregiver and explores independently. When in distress, will accept care from the caregiver or a stranger. And disorganized attachment. No stable attachment. Baby is confused and inconsistent in interaction with caregiver. So there are some benefits to secure attachment. Secure attachment between infant and caregiver allows caregiver to regulate infant's central and automatic nervous system development. It promotes healthy emotional development, promotes infant's nonverbal communication development in the right hemisphere of the brain, and also establishes appropriate relationship between self and the world and interpersonal relationships with others. And then there's failure of attachment. So studies show that orphans who have their basic needs met but no social interaction and spend their time lying in cribs are at risk of experiencing high death rates, emotional apathy, delayed physical, mental, and social growth, low frustration tolerance, eating disturbances, and depression. On an interesting note, parents' representations of their own early attachment experiences have been shown to have an impact on their infant's attachment security. So based on what we now know about the importance of attachment during infancy, Abby will now share information about the residential parenting program and how it can be a benefit to you and your baby.
The Washington State Department of Corrections has been offering the residential parenting program since 1999 and works with partnership with Puget Sound Education Service District. It teaches parent and infant bonding to incarcerated mothers. Program requirements for the residential parenting program. You must be pregnant upon arrival at the Department of Corrections. You have to have a nonviolent criminal history. Your sentences cannot be longer than 30 months post-birth, and you have to be eligible for work release into the community. The inmates will be screened prior to program admittance. The Department of Corrections will make admission decisions based on the above requirements as well as the inmate's behavior since incarceration. In this program, you will reside with your child in a separate designated unit, which is designed to house up to 20 mother-child pairs at a time. Mothers will receive training and support from early childhood educators. Residential parenting program participants will be enrolled in both pre- and postnatal programs, including parenting skills, child development, nutrition and family life skills, positive discipline, self-care, and self-esteem. Mothers will learn positive and effective parenting skills that aid in successful child development, as well as skills that prepare the mothers for self-sufficiency upon release. The Puget Sound Educational Service District Early Head Start provides childcare while mothers fulfill institution requirements such as work, training, and education. The goals of the residential parenting program include providing a safe environment that allows mothers and children to remain together. It allows mothers the option to breastfeed their children. It ensures a secure, healthy attachment forms between parent and child. It educates mothers in effective skills for both parenting and independence upon release. It prepares mothers and children for transition to work release following incarceration. And most importantly, it prevents the separation of mothers and babies. Because of what we know about the infancy stage and how important it is for your child's lifelong development, we feel that the residential parenting program is a fantastic asset. So our CTE stated, Washington State allows some female prisoners to have their infants with them in prison up until the children are 30 months old. Referring to our readings, make a case for why this is either healthy or unhealthy for the infant's development. So, now that we have given you our opinion, we want to know, what do you think? As social workers, how would you advise a client considering a program like this? Do you think programs like these are beneficial?
Well, I think one of the things that our class can take into consideration if the question is difficult is that having the baby around the mother during that time will help with what we talked about earlier in class, which is that serve and return, meaning that the baby will be with the mother, interacting with the mother, and then mom will interact with the baby in a positive manner, and that will help their relationship. So that way, when the mother is out of jail, that relationship continues, versus if the baby was separated from mother during her stay, then that relationship would stop and then have to restart once the sentence was over.
And Courtney, I see your message. It says, I think they are as long as their vetting process and have access to medical care as well as sanitary conditions. So I think that is obviously important, that as long as this program has the ability to, I guess, regulate and just make sure that, I guess the environment can, support the mother and baby, then I mean, my group, we really sat there and we thought, like, this sounds like a very, strange situation, but everything we've learned and everything we've studied, it seems to make sense that we'd want to keep the mother and baby together. So if a facility can do that,
on the internet, if you do some research on it, they have pictures of the units that the mother and child reside in, and they look like kind of like a dorm room, I guess, like a small apartment. I mean, they don't look like a prison cell. They can cook their own food. They get to spend the majority of the time with their children. And when they're not with the children are with like early Head Start educators.
That was one of the things that I was going to point out. I was thinking, I guess when I picture these kind of programs, I think of like a mother and her baby in a cell. Right. So my first thought is that wouldn't really be good for an infant because they're the type of interaction they can have with other people and the kind of toys that they can have for stimulation would be restrictive. But if you've got a program that allows them to have their own little home, so to speak, and if they have the appropriate, toys and stimulation and the mom's able to interact with their child. And then I think you guys also mentioned that there would be around other mothers with their infants. So if those infants are able to interact with basically with their peers, that would help them learn more of the social cues and interact with people their own age, so to say. So keeping all that in mind, it sounds certainly a lot better than the thought of a mother with an infant in a cell.
Mm-hmm.
I think too that a lot of times they're supposed to be, sorry.
I was just going to say, I know that some of the requirements for being able to participate in this program is being a nonviolent offender, but what about mothers who come into the system with a drug dependency problem or come in for drug-related crimes? How does that affect their ability to keep their infant with them? Because I know technically those are also considered nonviolent crimes, but they're also kind of jeopardize the overall well-being of their infant, especially if they have a drug dependency while pregnant.
Hillary, that's a very good question. I remember doing my research too, well, our group did, and I don't remember if that was mentioned. Abby, do you remember the mentioning drug dependency?
I don't remember anything about it. I would assume that they would take all of that into consideration and make sure that the child had everything that they needed, but they did not mention drug-addicted parents or drug-addicted children. So that is an interesting point.
Yes, that would be very different then. I also think about the fact that if you think about the demographic who's in these programs, the fact that the program will provide education to this group, I think is a very important thing. So it may not be the most ideal situation, but outside of this, that population or that demographic, I don't know if they'd be exposed or have the opportunity to get an education as a mother outside of this. And so that was another thing that made me think, oh, this isn't bad. This may be better than the alternative.
I also wonder, in response to the question about drug dependency and if they had been on drugs during pregnancy, I wonder if it would be kind of like, I know Helen Ross McNabb in Knoxville has a place where if the mother was dependent on drugs while pregnant, then they have the opportunity of I can't remember what it's called, but like where they're residents there and then they receive treatment for them and the baby. And I'm wondering if they would kind of treat it like that in prison as well. But then another point I also want to make was I think it's really important to think about how outside of the mother and outside of the facility that they're creating in this program, they may not have any safe caregiver to be with, depending upon the parent's background. So this might be the best start for the child.
Right.
I'm curious too about recidivism. I mean, will they allow you back into the program if you end up pregnant again and in trouble, or is it like a one-time chance type of thing?
Another good question that I don't know the answer to. Because also it doesn't seem like these programs are that common, just from the research I had done.
I think there were 12 states that offered them.
Right, exactly. And it seemed like Washington State was like a front runner as far as like what they offer. So yeah, that's another good question that we need to research.
Yeah, and it also does mention that like they'll take into consideration any previous interaction you've had with like child services. So that may be going along with the drug addiction, or if you've had, if you previously have children, they're going to take that under consideration as well before letting you join the program.
I think initially, when we started working on this, we were initially concerned about that setup of a child being in a prison with the mother. And at first, I think our initial thought was, no, they need to be in a more suitable place, something that we're used to. But then as we started to learn more, and then as we started going through the chapter, the different readings about maternal separation, how that can cause a negative impact, we were able to come to the decision that even though this isn't ideal, if we're able to keep children with their that maternal support without harming the child, then that's something that would be a good idea, as long as there are some barriers in place. And it appears that this program has that.
I have another question too. What if the father opposed?
I think, if the father was found to be able to have, provide a home for the child, then it wouldn't, I guess they'd probably have to take that into consideration. I don't know that they would necessarily, I would feel like they would choose the father if the father could provide a safe environment. It would be better than being in the prison.
Yeah, it probably has to do with like legal custody. So that, which is interesting. Yeah, it's interesting.
One of my thoughts for why at first I was opposed to this is when specifically, that's why I added it in my slide and attachment, the mother doesn't have to be the only caregiver. And so just as you'd mentioned, I think it was Cherise, about, what about the father? Not, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I first thought. Like, well, we don't need to do this. But then I think about, okay, nursing, like, okay, that there's as we talked about, there's importance of, being able to nurse a baby. Well, father can't do that. There's certain things where it's just like, well, this may be better. Yeah, as far as an alternative, certain things mothers can provide that, maybe another caregiver can't. So if the mother's willing and there's a program for it, sounds good.
So I have a follow-up question for y'all. Given that this program is funded through public dollars, so taxpayer dollars, what would you say to people, policymakers, public citizens who said, these moms are in jail and I don't see why my tax dollars should be paying for this kind of extra, service and the diapers and the this and the that, it's the parents who are incarcerated, not the children. So, there are some parents who are not imprisoned who don't have access to 24-hour care and, all of this stuff that's basically given to them. So what would you, so it's kind of like, in a way, sort of giving more resources to parents who are in jail versus parents who may be struggling and not incarcerated and don't have parent education classes and access to healthcare and support for their kids and learning how to, cook and learning all these skills and things like that. So what would you say, y'all in the group and anybody, what would you say to those folks with that argument?
I would say the first thing that came to my mind is I kind of also think about this as a preventative measure, because it seems like mom already has a history, she's already in the system. And from the readings we've had before, it's talked about how that early nurturing could possibly prevent a child having behavioral issues or possibly becoming a part of the system. So I would frame it as we're doing this so that we can possibly better our community in the future. So yes, you're making a contribution now, but you may, that contribution may improve society later. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like a two-pronged argument. One is, yes, the mother is incarcerated, and unfortunately the infant becomes a victim of circumstance or situation out of their ability to control. But also I was thinking, okay, either way, you're dealing with whether it's the infant being in the Department of Corrections or if an infant is relying on, or the family is relying on social welfare, you're still relying on tax dollars to help support and alleviate burdens that affect like their potential. So I feel like it shouldn't really matter where it occurs, because either way it seems like it's going to occur, whether you're dealing with a family that's incarcerated or you're dealing with a family that is living in poverty. Like there are programs that are funded by tax dollars outside of the Department of Corrections that we as citizens pay for to help alleviate burdens of families who can't necessarily break that cycle.
I would agree with that.
Sorry. I was going to say, I have to agree too, if, you know, people in poverty, young mothers in poverty, knowing about the program, wouldn't go out and just do some random crime to get them 12 months so they'll have good care for their child and good food and a place to stay. And, you know, what's the safeguard against people, I guess, trying to get in the program on purpose, in a way, is what I'm saying.
I mean, I would agree that we should look at this in my belief, we should look at prison as rehabilitation, because if we truly want to fix the problem, then it should be we are working to help them overcome whatever it is that has gotten them there. However, my question is, I mean, it's the question that's been posed, but like, we have little, like, small programs here and there for those who are in poverty and who struggle, but we have made it to where there are so many hoops to go through, it's difficult to get that help and to get to where they are at the same level as those who are incarcerated with this kind of program. So it's like, yeah, I think it's good that it is there, but what are we doing for those who are not putting themselves in that ill situation?
Exactly. I agree completely. I mean, it's a great idea, but there's so many people who've never committed a crime that need all kinds of help that aren't getting it. And I mean, that just makes you think, just like if a homeless person goes out and commit a crime just so he can get locked up and get a hot meal and a bath, and a person who can't feed themselves, who gets pregnant, you know, what's to keep them from going out to commit a crime just so they can get medical care and a good meal and, you know that their child is going to at least be taken care of in the womb, I suppose. I don't know. I can see more flaws than I can see benefits to that program.
Well, I mean, I have a good example of this as far as, something that's, I guess, a real situation. I mean, in my agency, I'm at the YWCA, and it's a domestic violence shelter, and we're very, the policy is that you have to be experiencing current domestic violence that you're fleeing from in order to be able to bring into shelter. It's the largest shelter in Tennessee. And we had a situation where someone, they knew, because of someone else who was inside, they knew how to work the system and what answers to give to get themselves and herself and her two young children into shelter. And then in the intake, found out that she lied, and three days later, she had to be exited, which was a very hard decision for the staff. I sat in the staff meeting and I was like, I was torn. But, so people, I don't know. I mean, people work the system, but the shelter still, they have their policy. They try, you try to uphold the program's policies. People maybe just need to get shelter, but this is not specifically the resource for that. So I think there are a number of resources or programs that probably deal with the same thing. There's just so much need. So I don't know if I would discount this program because there are so many people outside of it. I also think about the fact that money matters. And if you told a group of people who had to support this, well, like someone mentioned before, this infant, if it experiences enough ACEs from not being in this program, could end up perpetuating the cycle. And we spend more money on their resources they're going to need as well, because now they're in prison. I mean, so I think that you probably maybe end up spending more money down the road. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know where you draw the line as far as maybe, I don't know if this is the right phrase, hand-holding. I don't know, because that's what I felt last week when we had to exit this woman, 19-year-old and her 2 kids, because you got policies and we can't help everyone. And because you're here taking up a room, we've got people, we've got hospital in the nurses are calling from hospitals about other patients they have who are experiencing DV, and they're all looking for shelter, and we can't give them a room because you're in here, so it was a rough decision, but we had to exit her. So that's just an example.
You brought up an excellent point about, kind of like, I guess how you said it, like hand holding. And I kind of wanted to like piggyback off of the idea that like, yeah, there are going to be people that take advantage of certain systems. But I think also in regards to you speaking about policy, we also at kind of like a macro level need to address the fact that we are essentially making criminals for crimes that really aren't criminal in nature. And then that kind of perpetuates that cycle of like, well, it's easier to get assistance or aid when we're in the system, vice like adhering to like what is considered acceptable social norms, because it's much more difficult to get aid and assistance as, I guess, abiding by law than it is when you're already put into like the Department of Corrections. And I feel like if we got away from like incarcerating and identifying problems or disparities and then working on rehabilitation, that would kind of like circumvent the overwhelming need for like people in your situation with the YWCA, having to go there and essentially like commit fraud.
Yeah, exactly.
I just wanted to bring up the point that the difference between a program like this and other, social welfare programs is that people outside of the system of being incarcerated still have their children with them. And I can't imagine being an inmate, giving birth, and having my baby taken away from me and how devastating that is. So that's not going to help with rehabilitation at all, to give birth and not have any, very extremely limited access to your infant. So my feeling is that if these women are nonviolent offenders and don't have substance abuse problems, and they are willing to take part in the program, then, we should look at that from like a strengths-based approach, that they want to do this. And I even though that those tax dollars might be going towards this and somebody might be unhappy, it's like, if you look at it like from a humanity standpoint, especially if you're a mother, like just trying to put yourself into those shoes of having your child taken from you. I think it's just like, I would just try to give that perspective to somebody.
I agree with that totally. I mean, I would prefer the non-incarceration and maybe mandatory parenting program training outside of the prison, instead of keeping them in prison and building a daycare in the prison. And they're just, if they're worth that much to you, then don't incarcerate them for nonviolent offenses. Just, help them get better. Let them stay in their community with their baby and their families and their support systems, because they have a new baby. I don't know. I don't like it. I guess, I don't know.
It's hard. And, this is an excellent discussion. I really appreciate everybody putting it out there. And I threw that question out there to just kind of think about this, from kind of both sides. And there really are, conversations like this going on. And anytime you talk about a policy, and, you will have a full semester of policy next in the spring, but think about this conversation, if you can remember it, when you get there, because it really goes back to, what do we value? And the science, like I talked about with the lack of paid maternity leave for non-incarcerated people, that's a perfect example of how our society does not support the attachment science. And so here we have this very innovative policy that has said, look at this attachment science and look at, you know, what we can do for actually not really that much money. And it's also interesting because you could even frame this program, when you look at the outcomes, it has a 50% reduction in recidivism of the inmates. So you could actually take everything else away and say that this is actually an anti-recidivism program. It also just happens to have the benefit of promoting healthy attachment with, you know, these babies that then we wouldn't have to actually pay for to be in care. Because if they're not with their moms, it's entirely possible that a large majority of the time that the state is going to have to fund for whatever their care is, if they don't have a father or another caregiver that that could take those infants. So then you're paying money out for foster care and other types of care, and then it's just kind of like, you know, money sort of flying out the door, and it's really based on our values about how we choose to spend that, and it's just want to kind of put it out there to not forget about that values piece, and also that this is a really complicated issue. I mean, we can talk about, you know, I mean, some people are like, well, those mothers don't deserve those children. You know, well, maybe those children deserve those mothers. You know, I mean, maybe they deserve to be with their own mom. And who are we to say no? So there's just different, you know, you can be on a kind of all sides of this argument. I put a really compelling frontline video on neonatal absence syndrome under this unit. I hope that you all watched that. You know, the opioid epidemic in our country is huge. It's very huge in Tennessee, but very much so in other parts of the country. And, you know, the journalist in that video looked at this woman who's 19 years old, on methadone, struggling with her own addiction, trying to do everything she possibly can for her baby who is having these horrible withdrawal symptoms. And the journalist says, why do you deserve this baby? You know, how are you going to make it up to this baby that you did this? You know, there's this massive kind of public shaming of, you know, addiction and this view that like addiction is a moral failing. The same view is that of incarcerated people. You know, you have failed some way, you know, have not, you know, done X, Y, and Z. And granted, a lot of times there's some reason that they're there. They committed a crime. There's something going on. But like you said, you know, maybe let's just not incarcerate them for these little things anyway. You know, maybe there's something else. There's some other way. There's some kind of other diversion program. So just whenever we get, my kind of overarching point is like, whenever we get on these controversial topics, as a social worker, you are now in this field. For many of you, this is your first foray into social work. So when it gets hard, when you're in these conversations about, well, what about the mom and what about the baby and where this is complicated and where do we fit? Try to ground down into those that are code of ethics. What do our code of ethics say about how we should be treating these mothers? What does our code of ethics say about how we should be treating these babies? You know, do they align up? Do they not? Sometimes it's very, very complicated, but that's really the kind of the core source of inspiration and hopefully conflict resolution that you should look to. And so things like dignity and worth of the person. You know, why does this baby deserve to be taken away from their mom? Why does the mom deserve to have their, you know, baby is deserving really even a part of it? So really good discussion. I appreciate your input. Are there any final thoughts on this topic or questions for the group before we finish up? Nothing? All right. Well, it is 6:54, so we have gone right up to the end. So we have 6 minutes for our office hours. Don't mind at all going over. I really appreciate your discussion and engagement. So I will go ahead and stop recording and we'll see you soon. Feel free to continue to email me with any issues, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a good night.